Well, hello. Uh, Big welcome to today's event, this lunchtime from the York Festival of Ideas. My name is Tom McLeish. I'm a physicist in the Department of Physics at the uni, but I'm also Professor of Natural Philosophy, which enables me to explore connections between sciences, humanities, arts, social sciences, sticking things back together, which is interesting because today we're going to look at what happens when things fall apart. With Fighting Talk, we're going to be looking at fighting talk, conflict, warfare, metaphor. This is the third uh, event in a series called Science, Imagination and the Big Questions, which sets science in a broader context of the world, our challenges, and other ways in which human beings express themselves emotionally, intellectually, and collectively. And today we're going to be looking at when things fall apart. This series is sponsored by the John Templeton Foundation, for which we're very grateful. Just a few technical notes. If you're watching live, you can ask questions at any time using the Q&A bubble at the bottom of the screen. Don't wait till we get to past all the talks and to the open discussion. If a question occurs to you, put it in there. That'll help me enormously with suite of Marshall questions, put them together and create the discussion in the second half of today. If you have technical issues like a loss of Wi-Fi, don't worry, you drop out, you can always come back in using exactly the same link. You don't have to do anything else. And do also remember that today's event, like every event at the festival, is being recorded, and you can catch up with it later and tell your friends about it on the festival YouTube channel. Subtitles are also available in closed caption, imaginative reinterpretations of the English language sometimes. That's also seen for fun. At the bottom of the screen, you can toggle CC live transcript, and you can turn that on if you want, or off if it's bothering you or causing you too much amusement. So today, I'm very, very fortunate and very happy to introduce two colleagues of mine, both from the University of York, both in the Department of Sociology, and they are both, like me, involved in a project which is examining the role of narrative within religious faith communities and science, within a project called Equipping Christian Leadership in an Age of Science. It's York, Durham, and has researchers also in the Church of England's research office in London. Our first speaker is Dr. Amanda Rees. Amanda is historian of science, as I said, based here in the Department of Sociology. She works on the history of field sciences, particularly on narratives, history of the future, and she's published a very great deal. Most lately, her book with Charlotte Slee on the human. She's also editor of the British Journal of the History of Science. So with no further ado, let's hear from Dr. Amanda Rees. Thank you, Mandy.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm just going to, I hope, start sharing my screen, and I hope that you should be able to see this now. So essentially, what I want to do is to set the scene for our discussion by talking to you about an event called the Science Wars. So what are the Science Wars is the question with which we'll begin. What were they? Do we really have a war about science? Well, basically, where they began was in 1962. A guy called Thomas Kuhn publishes a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And in that book, what Kuhn demonstrated was that the history of science didn't just consist of a whole bunch of people discovering more and more facts about the natural world and piling them up into bigger and bigger piles of knowledge. But that instead, what the history of science consisted of was a series of revolutions, not just in what was known, but in what could be known about what was known about the natural world, if I can put it in that slightly convoluted way. It involved the shifting of paradigms, the changing of paradigms. The classic example is, of course, the shift from the Aristotelian world to the Copernican world, the shift from an Earth-centered universe to a sun-centered universe. And what he was doing in this book is showing that what we think of as science, what we think of as scientific activity, is not something that's handed down from on high. It doesn't appear in tablets of stone. It doesn't exist out there in the clouds waiting to be picked up. Instead, it's an activity. It's something that's done by human beings in collaboration with each other and in interaction with the rest of the natural world. And that these human beings are operating within a particular kind of philosophical, cultural, social context. And that context has an important influence on what they do and why they do, what they want to do and how they can do things. So in the crudest sense, the crudest way of putting kind of Kuhn's perspective here was actually kind of encapsulated by a comment made by Max Planck. He said effectively, you know, science advances one funeral at a time, as the people committed to an old set of ideas die off and a new generation kind of grows up with kind of the new ideas. Now, what Kuhn's work did was to inspire a whole lot of other colleagues in the humanities and in the social sciences to start thinking about science in this way, not as something that's separate from society, but as something that human beings do, as a human activity. Basically to say, look, here is this incredibly successful system for manipulating and for understanding the world around us. You know, compare it to, Tom's introduced us as being in a sociology department. You put half a dozen sociologists in a room and you'll get at least 20 different interpretations of how the social system works. But scientists can reach agreements. How is it that they can manage to do that? So pretty much everybody that I know who studies science and scientists in this way, they do it for precisely that reason, because they're fascinated by it, because they are committed to the idea that science and scientists, they're the most important people in many ways that you can possibly study in the world, because they can literally change it. They can literally change the world in which we live. However, that approach, that new approach to looking at the history of science didn't really go down terribly well with some scientists. And this has to do with the way in which scientists themselves account for disagreement and controversy. So, I mean, I've spent a lot of my career actually studying scientific controversies and talking to scientists who are involved in intense debates. And the one thing that is very, very evident is that when you ask scientists to account for disagreements, they basically say, well, you know, I think this because I'm right, but so-and-so over there, he thinks that because of, well, he was trained in a particular tradition, or he doesn't have the right equipment, or she doesn't have a feeling for the organism, or they don't fully understand the new philosophical, the new theoretical framework, so on and so forth. So they account for error. Scientists tend to account for error by reference to social context. And then along came a whole bunch of historians and sociologists who are basically saying, well, look, you can actually use the social context to account for getting things right as well. And from the perspective of scientists, that was basically, it kind of implied that they were getting things wrong. Now, you know, you can see on the screen there, I've put up a few, this is on the right-hand side. It's a piece of scientific humor that you quite often see in labs around the world, which is kind of like the background to the methodology section of scientific papers. You know, on the one hand, you've got the what is actually written down as the official version, and then on the other side, you know, what actually happened. You know, it has long been known, well, I can't be bothered to look up the reference, is the translation of that. It seemed to scientists that what we were doing was effectively taking that right-hand side of the table out and making out that this was all that science was, that we were dismissing it in that way. And understandably, that caused quite a bit of friction. And it was exacerbated by the fact that at the same time, as this new approach to studying science was kicking off, there was also evident an increased interest on the part of the natural sciences, scientists themselves, in studying the history and culture of human beings, basically treating the kind of the cultural and the social lives of human beings in the same way that people would study the social lives of animals. So the emergence of new areas of scientific exploration, like sociobiology, like evolutionary psychology, where scientists tried to account for racism, for sexism, even for infidelity by reference to Darwinian evolution. That this, though you could give an evolutionary account, you could say most problematically that humans had evolved to do X, Y, and Z. And this in turn annoyed quite a lot of historians and anthropologists and sociologists who basically thought that human behavior was far too complex to be reduced to numbers in this way, and who were also very wary of the notion that by trying to explain the origins of racist behavior, for example, what was actually happening was that scientists were in some way trying to excuse it, you know, casting it as in some way natural. So that's what caused the science wars, in essence, where people on both sides of the two cultures, or the great divide, as C.P. Snow put it, both sides felt that the core practices, the core beliefs of their own disciplines, were under direct and sustained attack. So objectivity for scientists, sociologists were basically saying that everything is relative, there is no such thing as objective knowledge, and complexity and uniqueness, human complexity and human uniqueness for the humanities. And frankly, in many ways, what happened then was there was some engagement with caricatures of other people's arguments, a certain amount of leaping to assumptions or making assumptions about the motivations or the practices. Nobody actually got physically hurt in all of this, although there was an interesting moment in 1995 when basically the FBI subpoenaed the membership of the American History of Science Society, basically because they were worried that the relativistic, quote unquote, history of science was proving to be something of a spur to domestic terrorism within the United States, specifically the case of the Unabomber. If people remember that particular character, the fear was that it was an encounter with radical history of science that had in some ways radicalized the Unabomber, which seems very old from this perspective now. But so, as I say, nobody from the point of view of the academic debates were hurt in this. A lot of ink was spilt, but the point is still, I've tried to come up with a metaphor for understanding it, and I'm kind of thrown back on sports in this sense. You know, we're all playing the same game. We are all committed to, or we're at least ostensibly all committed to, the same principles. Manchester City fans may not understand why Manchester United fans support Manchester United, but they are all fundamentally on the same pitch. They're all obeying the same rules. They're all listening to the referee, and they're all committed to the progress of the game itself. So why is it that this got framed as a war rather than a game? What's interesting is the way in which a debate, a discussion between academics comes to be framed as warfare. In itself, a massive escalation of the stakes, a massive raising of the temperature. If we're at war, then what do the losers pay reparations? How do you define winning and losing? Do we have to make restitution? Are there war crimes? Are there war criminals? How does that work out? And the science wars are not the only context, obviously, in which the narrative of war is used as a framing, as a means of interpreting the relationship between science and other areas of human endeavour. So, for example, Tom mentioned at the outset here that he and Fran and myself are all involved in a project which works to understand the relationships between, which works to understand how the conflict narrative between science and religion, the notion that science and religion are inevitably somehow at war with each other. We're on a project that works to challenge these assumptions because, let's face it, there is very little empirical evidence to support the idea that science and religion are somehow in conflict. There's considerable rhetoric involved in that debate, and I've put up on the slide there some examples of that. So you can see there on the left-hand side, the kind of one of the very early kind of statements of position in the kind of warfare narrative of science and society, the Draper and White hypothesis, which essentially tried to present science as the inevitable opponent of Roman Catholicism in particular. You've got the famous confrontation between Galileo and the Inquisition, and you've got some more recent examples of scientists in particular, arguing that somehow there is this inseparable kind of battle, this inseparable gulf between the two perspectives. But Dawkins is actually the students of, or was one of the students of, worked in the department of this guy here, Alistair Hardy. We think of evolutionary science in particular as a problem for religion. And again, that's a product of rhetoric much more than it's an actual product of empirical evidence here. We can see, if we look at the history of biology, innumerable examples, and some very, very prominent examples of scientists who didn't just practice religion themselves, but who actually took their religious beliefs as an inspiration for their scientific activity, who actually based some of their theoretical musings on what they understood to be their relationship with the divine, with the deity. The examples that I've given, Alistair Hardy on this side here, and William Thorpe. These are both major figures in the field that we now know as evolutionary ecology. And they absolutely accepted the principle that their belief was totally compatible with evolutionary analysis and with scientific practice. Hardy, for example, took a biological approach to try and study the roots of revolution, but he did so in a way that wasn't reductionist, that still took account of the complexity and of the irreducibility of religious belief. What they were trying to do in a manner that's very reminiscent of the kind of the pre-Darwinian and during the Darwinian period as well, 19th century scientists, they are engaging with their sense of the divine through the active and the questioning observation of the natural world. It's the complete opposite of any kind of blind acceptance or blind acceptance of received authority. It's an active, a questioning observation. But that's kind of the point though, isn't it? Because what the war narrative does is make it much harder to avoid that kind of sense of obedient conformity. The war narrative itself actively fosters and asks against them a position of threat, a position of mortal danger approach, encouraging, as I say, the sense of conformity and deterring any kind of challenges to established authority. If you've got war, you've got traitors. But that's also why it just doesn't make sense to have this narrative, have this war narrative being used in a scientific setting. And when it moves from the scientific setting to the public setting, it becomes ever more problematic because of the way in which it divides as well as unifies communities. And I think one of the clearest expressions of this can be found in the way in which the media has covered and the way in which government and science and the government and scientists have approached communicating with the public about health matters during the past 15 months of the COVID epidemic. So on that point, I don't really want to say next slide, please, but it's kind of inevitable in this context. I'm going to hand back to Tom, and Fran will take you through that particular example of using war as a means of communicating complex information. Thanks for listening.
Mandy, thank you very much indeed. For that first salvo in our war and conflict narrative discussion this lunchtime. So as indeed promised, our next speaker to take us into a more time localized, more current analysis of conflict stories and narratives in the application of science, particularly in healthcare, is Dr. Franziska Kohlt. She, as I said, is a researcher in science communication, the history of science and literature. She's also an active science communicator with an interest in the socio-psychological history of what narratives make science communication effective. Also a researcher within the ECLAS project that Mandy also mentioned. Fran is also editor of the Lewis Carroll Review and the review editor for the British Society of Literature and Science. So I'm surrounded by people who edit things, and so at this point, Fran, please take us on into narratives of warfare in science, how and why to resist them. Thanks.
Hello, and I very much hope I've now succeeded in sharing my slides.
Yeah.
So, and I'm really glad you've chosen to be here, and that after a year and a half of talking about nothing but COVID, you have come to a talk that suggests talking a little bit more about COVID. So thank you very much for being here. These days, we hear a lot about recovery and rebuilding and building back better. But rebuilding requires taking apart and reconstructing. And the reconstructing of one part of our daily lives that hasn't really been at the very top of everyone's priority lists is that of our language, specifically the language of metaphors that we use to frame our relationship with the challenges around us, be that COVID-19 or climate change, and why we so often end up describing them in terms of warfare, despite there being volumes of literature on this subject telling us that this is a really bad idea. So this talk will be an exploration of how language not only produces our understanding of, but also our relationship with these challenges, and in fact, how it can enhance or limit our ability to solve and overcome them, and how it does so often completely without us noticing. But becoming sensitive to the fact we can harness the power of language also to turn around our relationship and our ability to manage future challenges. I began this talk with a remark about COVID-19 and the way in which politicians and the media have framed the management of COVID-19 in the UK since the start of the pandemic as a war or as a battle against COVID. Trying to forward, yeah, here we go. And we've become so used to hearing health workers be referred to as the frontline, as heroes, their PPE as their armor. The government were really keen to frame themselves as a war cabinet that declared war on the virus, and they talked about the deployment of the vaccine as one more weapon in the arsenal of fighting COVID-19. We have commemorated the fallen heroes of the pandemic in an 11 o'clock silence and seen Spitfire flyovers cheering on the National Health Service, as you can see here on the bottom left. Those terms are not coincidental. And after over a year of monitoring government and media communications, I can say with absolute confidence that they have not only come to dominate COVID culture in the UK, they have become it. And what I mean by when I say this is that we have not only come to use war words when describing our relationship with COVID-19, the relationship has widely come to be understood as one of warfare. We have actually, to some degree, started behaving as if it was actually a war. This might sound really weird, surprising, or in fact, like I'm exaggerating. But in considering the effect that metaphors and narratives have on our understanding of the world around us and on directing the actions within it, it's in fact exactly what we would expect. So let's have a closer look of how that works and what that means in practice. George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, in their seminal studies on metaphors, invite us to consider the metaphor of argument as warfare, beginning with a reflection on how this metaphor functions in our everyday language. Your claims are indefensible. He attacked every weak point in my argument. His criticisms were right on target. I've never won an argument with him. He shot down all of my arguments. As you can see, all metaphors of warfare in something that isn't war. They then ask, imagine a culture which conceived of argument as a dance, so that is aesthetically pleasing and performed in a balanced and pleasing manner. Would this culture recognize the act of argument as performed by members of the Anglosphere as something they call argument? Now, the same thing holds true for the way in which COVID has been framed globally, because other metaphors were available in completely different languages framed COVID in completely different terms. One example, for instance, was the prominent use of water metaphors. In Germany, for instance, the word Eindämmung was used most prominently for the management of COVID, which means to build dams in order to contain COVID. The water metaphor was, of course, also with us in the Anglophone sphere in the language of the first and second waves of the coronavirus. And this is a good moment to pause and to reflect. Thinking of a flood or a wave as opposed to being on the front lines of war, how does this make us feel? How do the two make us want to act? How would we want to be seen by others? To be acting in the face of these challenges? And what would we think is desirable behavior in those two situations? In a flood, perhaps you would run, shelter, distance yourselves from the potentially damaging impact, but you'd perhaps also have expectations towards the responsibility of others, especially of authorities. Shouldn't someone have prevented the flood or prepared for protecting communities for the impact of the flood? Protective barriers, such as dams, or in the case of COVID, protective equipment. It would almost certainly feel very different from being in a battle or a war, where you want to show that you're not afraid of the enemy. You want to heroically run perhaps into the firing lines to show them. Something that isn't advisable at all in a flood. And yet, these are just two framings for precisely the same public health crisis, in which the behaviors suggested by scientific guidance were globally, broadly speaking, the same when it came to things such as social distancing, isolation, and staying at home. Pausing and reflecting and asking ourselves the question of how different metaphors and narratives can make us feel, despite being only words, puts us in a good position to reconsider the wider effect of such framings, especially when it comes to directing behaviors in public or other crises. This lands us right in the territory of my field of study, the work of science communication. And the purpose of good science communication and any analogy or metaphor used in this process is, as the term metaphor itself in fact means, to transfer meaning, to explicate and to illuminate the meaning that is being conveyed. We're also firmly in the area of risk communication, and in public health or in any other crisis, the purpose of such communication is to reduce and prevent morbidity and mortality. Any figure of speech, any communication tool that distorts, obfuscates, or even inverts vital scientific information from being conveyed cannot be a matter of preference, but thus becomes a matter of ethics. And it is no longer just words. And here lies the danger. The warfare framing of COVID-19 met with immense enthusiasm in some parts of the population. People have found it uplifting, and huge crowds were keen to display the Blitz spirit of defiance, with the BBC even initiating a sing-along of "We Meet Again," the war song referenced by Queen Elizabeth II in her coronavirus address. But these crowds were also the perfect illustration of the mantra of those using the metaphor in order to, quote, bring the nation together. And the literal enactment of this phrase makes manifest how scientific guidance and the language through which it is mediated can pull us into diametrically opposed directions, when the guidance is to stay apart, at home, and in isolation. On the other side of this narrative, we were faced with immense discomfort of scientists and of health workers, and their concerns that their voices and the concerns they voiced felt drowned out. The narrative of sacrifice of health workers being particularly disturbing to them, as they felt it should not be normalized, as in the reality in the life of a soldier as something heroic or worth aspiring to, as it is at odds with modern ideals of healthcare, in which excess death by lack of staff protection is considered a marker of failure of management. So we come to see that narratives that are rousing and employed with the best of intentions can in fact obscure the reality that these narratives can also be polarizing and divisive, creating a binary of two sides, right or wrong, as Mandy just said, and acceptable, non-acceptable. They're also narratives that are elastic and can extend immediately to be synonymous with other binaries, those with power, those without, dividing between those with rights and the oppressed, something that we have seen in discourses of lockdown and vaccine refusal. And when the reality of the situation is a lot more complex and a lot more nuanced, this can become problematic when such language is used unconsciously, as we acquire language through osmosis from the world around us and often don't reflect and just use it. But it can become even more complicated when it is used consciously with malintent, relying on the way language operates unconsciously to divide. And something that we have seen before COVID in climate change debates, or a selection of so-called culture war narratives in which binaries of oppression or power can even stand in diametric opposition to the realities that they frame. We should also be especially sensitive of narratives of dominion, such as the war narrative, in whatever context, be it over a virus or climate or nature in general, for their othering quality, but especially also when they are being used in a scientific context. That does not automatically mean that what these narratives convey is in fact scientific or endorsed by the consensus of scientific evidence. While such narratives might be carelessly employed, they can be deliberately deceptive. Because we are so used to them being used in a scientific context, they are utilized to give arguments enveloped in them scientific credibility where they might not have any. Thus, the best thing is to do is to pause and to reflect on whether a metaphor passes the test. Is it accurately transferring meaning from one realm to another? We do not even need to jettison the feel-good factor, but we need to just carefully balance it against what we want to achieve with their use. Instead of narratives of dominion over nature, be it viruses or climates, coexistence and management of relationship with nature, which makes a virus a bit more like managing a flood. Don't build your houses in a flood belt, rather than declaring a war on rivers, which does really sound a bit silly when we look at it that way. And to conclude, as language is part of our culture, we can build communities and direct actions around rhetoric that is not divisive, but healing, that does not make us feel helpless, but empowers. And while I now will hand over to the final part of the panel, we will consider narratives of overcoming and mending divisions in the discussion. Thank you so much.
And thank you very much for taking us in a lovely example of detail from some of the broader questions of conflict around science to the particular metaphors we've used. And what I'd like to do now is to take a few minutes and go even broader perhaps, and set for a little while the discussion in the context of this series of events as a whole. Yesterday, but just before we discuss everything together, and thank you everyone for the questions that are already coming in. They're marvelous, and I'm looking forward to taking them on board. But to feed that a little bit, I'd like to take the camera angle on metaphor right back even further, both historically and in terms of subject matter, and take a few lessons from yesterday's discussion. Doesn't matter if you weren't here. We had scientists and poets together talking about that way of describing difference, division, divisiveness, the two cultures, if you like, behind the science wars, and questions around the poetic, or the imaginative, or the creative as pathways to truth, rather than purely what we associate with the scientific. I became so frustrated, annoyed, disturbed by the lack of understanding of the role of imagination in science as well as in art. A few years ago, I did some research and wrote a book about it. There, it's called Poetry, Music of Science, and that's what behind what I'm going to say for a few minutes, which picks up the themes of reconciliation that Fran talked about, and Mandy, but also some of the alternative questions that they both raised. What if we talked about water management rather than war? What if we talked about a game, said Mandy, rather than battles? But I think that some of the energy behind the science wars and the COVID wars go back centuries. Even William Blake, there he is painting Newton at the bottom of the sea, talked about the two directions of thinking in the world, the philosophical, what we call now scientific, rational demonstration that he ascribed to Francis Bacon, John Locke, Isaac Newton. Blake said, I will not reason and compare. My business is to create. Then a century later, had romantic poets like John Keats accusing science, he would use the word natural philosophy then, of unweaving the rainbow, taking wonder, sort of sapping wonder out of the world. And so those were at least 2 centuries behind. Mandy's already mentioned C.P. Snow. And the two cultures from which we particularly suffer even now educationally in England. And yet another romantic poet, William Wordsworth, who cropped up in yesterday's discussion, predicted in his preface to the lyrical ballads with Coleridge that the remotest discoveries of the botanist, chemist, mineralogist will be one day proper objects of the poet's art as any on which it can be employed, which will surprise people today. It surprised me. But he made that conditional. He said that this would occur if, there's an if in that paragraph, but the time should come when the matters talked about by these sciences became familiar to us in our both enjoyment and our suffering. I do actually wonder whether the suffering side of science that's been manifest through COVID has done some good in opening up the scientific view into the substrate of biological life that's viruses and vaccines. Turned out that halfway through the last century, Michael Robert Hunt also wrote a book about poetry and science, but rather different from my view. There was no commonality in intellectual engagement between the writing of a poem and science. I think there rather is, but it's just that that science could be an object of glorious inspiration. No, the fumes of the laboratory and so forth do not appear fitted for a place in the painted bowers of the muses. And a literary scholar, Dr. Huber, Ingrid Huber from Munich, has said that she identifies the origin, the nucleus of the two cultures, the parting of ways of the sciences and the humanities, with poetry in the mid-19th century. And as if you listen to her, there's Edgar Allan Poe talking about science as a vulture that preyest on the poet's heart, whose wings are dull realities, as if reality is always dull. But if we go back earlier, to the 17th century, it turns out that writing poems about science was common fare. Milton did it. A great friend of Newton, Elizabeth Tollett, wrote poems about science. Margaret Cavendish, one of the greatest natural philosophers, commentators on the experimental method, wrote dozens of poems about atoms, which she published in 1653. And if you want to know more about atoms, do recommend you log on to the festival event, Atoms and Literature, run by my colleague, the head of English, this evening. Poetry and science becomes the metaphor for conflict, or for dualism, if you like. We've already met Richard Dawkins, but let's hear him say that science is for him the only way to understand the real world, as if music and poetry and art and even politics isn't real, which is why Mary Midgley, the philosopher, Newcastle philosopher, entitled the book, which was really her inveighing against a materialist reductionist framing of science. She's not anti-science at all. She's anti a sort of deeply reductionist view of science. She called that book Science and Poetry, because I think she thinks, as I do, that bringing science and poetry together, perhaps poetry might be another metaphor, even for doing science, like a game, like managing water, that isn't conflict. Malcolm Gleicher was with us yesterday, says that the poet, he writes, as much as the philosopher or the scientist, is concerned with helping us to look beyond surfaces in the world at what's really there. You can't develop a vaccine without looking below the surface of the world to see what's really there. Ursula Le Guin, who died recently, didn't she? Wonderful writer of science fiction, talks about both celebrating, both poetry and science celebrating, but the science is looking from the outside, poetry describing from the inside. I wonder whether that's in fact really because she hasn't experienced science, which also explicates from the inside, or implicates from the inside, but she sees something deep within there. We also picked up Goethe yesterday, who said that science and poetry have the same meaning, but here's the same origin. But here's Mary Midgley talking about words like mind and body emerging in both poetry and science. So what about Wordsworth's vision, which we met before? It turns out that there are many scientists working today and over the last century who, perhaps quietly, but write poems alongside their science. There are many poets writing today who find the below the surface of the world, structures of beauty and wonder that Malcolm Guite talked about, fit for poetry. Mary Peelan is one of them. And we welcomed others yesterday. There are anthologies of science-inspired poems and science-inspired poets, biographies by the dozen now. So what's the problem? Why is there still antagonism? Why might there still be science wars? And both Wordsworth and Peter Meadow and other commentators on science today seem to agree that it's, if you like, a failure on the part of scientists like me to find language, to find doorways or pathways into science as something inspirational, human, poetic, as much as it is quantitative and logical, as emotional as it is cerebral, so that others can find ways of entering and sharing and framing science healthily. Art lives from constraints and dies from freedom, says Leonardo da Vinci, but that's something that resonates with science as well. Igor Stravinsky talks about the constraints of the world on the musician, the chains that free rather than shackle. And it seems to me that the role of science is to reimagine the world and what could call on greater power of imagination than that, but within the constraints of the world as it's observed, and what could constitute the tighter poetic form than that. So that's my sixpenny worth for a new metaphor for science, is doing poetry. So we've had games, we've had water and poetry, and now I'd like to invite both Dr. Rees and Dr. Kohlt, Mandy and Fran, back onto the stage, as it were, with me and our audience, and we can engage in a bit of discussion. Let me just kick off just for a few moments and say I'm really interested in the alternative narratives that you posed, and I'm so glad you did. Water management, games, and poetry. Mandy, can I ask you which you prefer? Did you or are there other alternatives to warfare that you'd like to propose?
I'm very tempted to immediately hand this over to Fran, who I know has some very, very good ideas about the alternative kinds of narratives that could be posed. But I personally, I prefer the idea of the game. I don't like using football metaphors. I think I have to say this is the first time in my life I've ever used a football metaphor. I blame my son, who has somehow managed to become a football fan for reasons possibly not unconnected with current events. But it shows, it allows for passion, and it allows for disagreement within rules, within a setup, within a framework. And I suppose that's why I'm drawn towards that as a narrative that could possibly resonate in. I mean, one of the reasons why the war narrative is so dominant is because of its resonance, is because it is extraordinarily good at doing what it does. I wonder whether or not the game narrative could draw on some of that while ameliorating some of the problems that the war one causes. But I will turn over to Fran now, because Fran, I know it's really good.
1-0 to your son then, but over to Fran then for other alternative ideas.
There's an sheerly endless palette of metaphors that we could be using, but the boring answer to this is, in order to find the metaphor that is fit for the purpose that is needed in any specific situation, every situation has to be evaluated separately. And it's been really interesting to follow some of the audience questions on this, because there are questions on this, and one of the first ones was, well, we're all metaphors like this. And of course, as we've discovered in our research, a lot of the warfare narrative was extremely dominant in the UK, but also elsewhere. But there's also rules to where it was popular. We could, for instance, see that male politicians used it more than female ones, perhaps unsurprisingly, but also perhaps unsurprisingly, some nations with former colonial power used it more than others. which was interesting. But there was, of course, also other metaphors used in the UK. And one person who was extremely good at coming up with metaphors fitting the purpose and fitting the situation was Jonathan Van Tam, who appeared at the daily briefings, the COVID briefings, quite a few times. And when we were monitoring the responses to metaphors used in a COVID context, everybody was a bit bored and annoyed and fed up with COVID every time. But every time Jonathan Van Tam came on, it's like, oh my God, he's so good at explaining what he's doing. And for instance, one of the things that really stuck with me and I use as an example of a very good metaphor was when he compared the vaccine rollout to a train. Because everybody has some experience what a train is and how it works and how it arrives at the platform. And when you can see it coming, but it's not quite there yet. And at first you make sure that people who are vulnerable and can't walk so well get in. And, he explained the entire system of how the vaccine will work and how it affects people and what delays might occur and so on and so forth with this metaphor. But that wasn't a metaphor that we'd popularly heard before, but it was one that really suited the situation. And this is really how good metaphors work. You have a thorough understanding of the science, but you then weigh it against something that can really illuminate it to the audience.
So in your research, Fran, did you find in terms of other countries, were other countries using radically different metaphors, and did you have a favorite one, or did you see a nation that you thought was rolling out metaphors really effectively?
I think one of my favorites that popped up relatively late in the pandemic also popped up in a German context. And that was when Angela Merkel cited in Parliament a popular science communicator, sort of a YouTube star in Germany, Mai-T Nguyen Kim, who explained how COVID works in terms of a piggybacking drunk at a party, because it can't move on its own. You have to carry it along, and it's a bit annoying. You have to drag this drunk person from one pub to another because otherwise they can't come with you. And it was really, really interesting how she came up with a really elaborate metaphor on YouTube that explained it to the sort of YouTube generation extremely well, but actually ended up being used in Parliament by no less Angela Merkel to explain how it works in order to counter some of the sort of fake narratives and COVID denial narratives that were featured in German Parliament. So that was another favorite, and shows you how important creative and innovative science communication really is and what impact it can have.
There are a couple of questions that have been asked while we're still on the subject of COVID narratives and warfare, that take a positive and a negative line on what the warfare narrative might do. And I'd love to hear both of your comments on that. One has picked up on something that I know one of you said about, I think it was Maddie, but on traitors. So if you're in a war, is there not a danger that those who disagree are not just people who disagree for different reasons, but they actually become traitors and stigmatized, and then you're in you've taken a very dangerous pathway. On the other hand, another participant asks, wouldn't we agree that Captain Tom's campaign was more effective and got more attention because he was a soldier? What do you think about that?
Absolutely, wants to start on this one.
Mandy, any thoughts on that negative and positive tension around warfare?
I think a big part of the problem here is that the UK is so tied up and so invested in the events from 1939 to 1945 in a way that is, I don't think personally, is particularly healthy for our democracy or for our body politic. We constantly see references back to that period of the Second World War, and it perpetuates a particular story about plucky little Britain standing alone, London calling the free world, kind of thing, which is not exactly an accurate representation of how things played out in many ways. I mean, I think that the traitor point is important. That's why I wanted to bring it up, because it makes it, if you're at war, then people who oppose you are a direct threat to you. They're a threat to not just your sense of well-being, but they're a threat to your to life and limb, and it raises the stakes in a way that is problematic and dangerous. And I think we've seen that playing out to some extent with vaccine refusals. And that's one of the reasons why that really bothers me. I'm going to leave the Captain Tom narrative because I think Fran might have some interesting things to say about that in relation to the other part of what we've been talking about, which is the relationship between science and religion, and the extent to which Captain Tom became invested or was invested by the public and by the media with near saint-like qualities almost. So Fran, over to you.
Yeah, well, I will just add a little bit to the point that you've been saying about the, on the one hand side, the obsession almost with the Second World War, or particular narrative of the Second World War, but also how that plays out in scientific debates. You know, we mentioned sort of lockdown opposition, vaccine denial, and so on and so forth. Which illustrate absolutely perfectly why polarizing narratives that have a black and a white side are completely inadequate to these discussions. Because when you have a situation when either side feels silenced, that's not good, because discussion needs to happen. We're talking about the health of democracy. Having concerns is not the same as denial, and that's really important. But it is also important that on either side, from which direction your criticism or your concern might come, and your lack of understanding, which is fine. You know, this is why one of the popular narratives that I always a really big fan of is narratives of learning and discovery and wonder, because we're all constantly in a perpetual state of wonder and finding out things about the world, and that's not a bad thing, as much as we want to say, you know, that's what children do. As adults, we know how stuff works, but you know, just between you and me, we don't. But the particularly interesting thing about this is a theory called the spiral of silence, which is a theory by Elisabeth Noelle-Neumann, who looks exactly at how these dynamics of silencing work. And if you have a black and white narrative, you will always have a side that feels silenced, which is really problematic. And this is where we come to Captain Tom. There is this cultural preference and a sort of cultural infatuation almost with war narratives for a historical reason, but for cultural reasons also in the UK. We have in the past seen that whenever there's a fundraiser related to something military, it does better as a fundraiser than that is not related to in somehow military ways. But the important thing to consider here is also that this is something that Captain Tom was seen as someone who displayed sort of ideal British values that were sort of ideal military values as well. But we also saw the other side of this, how on the one hand side, he did what he did very well, and it was extremely successful, extremely, you know, great that he did it. But that in itself has nothing to do with COVID management. But when it got to the point that the very elderly Captain Tom went on a journey to Barbados, which annoyed quite a lot of people who couldn't travel and so on, and people said, oh no, he can do that because he's done his bit, it became really evident that military virtues and, you know, he's done his bit, he's earned his honor, now he can do whatever he wants, is not a narrative that works in medicine. Military values have no currency there. And this is simply another illustration of why this is a really inappropriate narrative to use in medicine. So on the one hand side, that Captain Tom did what he did extremely well was for the reason of the cultural resonances. And the anonymous person who asked that question was completely right. There were people who did very similar things and earlier than Major Tom, which however didn't take off. For exactly that reason. But it's also an illustration of why it doesn't work and why, you know, we shouldn't sort of conflate areas of national values, military values, as being applicable to every situation.
Yeah, I wonder if we could then take, having identified sort of these saintly, religious almost resonances with Captain Tom into there's a little collection of really interesting directions into the science, religion, ethics, morality. Are there dualisms or is there one? And I wonder if we could take these in a sort of discussion. So, so Colin Challen asks whether God is merely another word for ineffable, or that which cannot, that of which we cannot speak, and is something that's ineffable. Therefore, can that be submitted to scientific verification. Whereas Jeff Beacon also raises the idea of, can you do science on something less effable, which is morality? Was Hume right? He says, arguing that rightness and wrongness cannot be discovered through scientific investigation. I mean, Kant would also agree. Kant saw these entirely two worlds. And then Rosie asks us whether we think that science and religion are less in conflict now than previously, or do we have a distorted view of the past? If they're less in conflict, does it indicate tolerance on both sides? So here are polarizations. I guess we've got a few things in one, but God is ineffable, and not are there things of which science cannot speak? Morality, and the history of science and religion. I'm not going to say anything more because that's given me homework that I'm left me scratching my heads. But perhaps Fran or Mandy would like to kick off on that one.
I think it's a really interesting one, because we were just ending on the notion of Captain Thomas as a somewhat saintly figure, and the notion that in public discourse that was sort of portrayed as a sort of, he can get away with this and don't you dare criticize him in some corners of that discourse. But what's also really interesting, and I know I've talked about this with Tom in a different context, is the hagiography of scientists. And Richard Dawkins, for instance, is a really good example, because how dare you criticize this person for saying something because they're a scientist, and if you disagree with them on something, you're disagreeing with the entirety of science and everything science stands for, which again is sort of a really good illustration of polarized discourse and why this is a completely inappropriate metaphor or rhetoric to choose in such a discourse, as scientists should know best, because science is self-refining. There's always improvements and progress to be made at so many different corners, and you can't be monolithic on that at all. So that's a really interesting one. So I don't think science and religion are more polarized than they have been. This narrative of science religion division, as Mandy has illustrated, has been very consciously constructed for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it takes so much acknowledgement and so much revising the historiography of science and going back to questioning what we think we know to actually realize that stories like the one we know about Darwin discovering evolutionary theory, in brackets he didn't, and somehow everybody stopped going to church and believing in God, which is also not accurate, just not being true. And the same with the Galileo story not being true. I think this requires a lot from us, from all of us, which I think is why I wanted to put the focus of my talk on the pausing and thinking and reflecting and just allowing wonder about complexity.
And I loved learning from Mandy that Richard Dawkins' supervisor had actually written about and thought deeply and written on how evolutionary biology and our understanding of the tree of life, as it were, fits into a theological Christian framework. But this is, this ought to get out of the history books, Mandy, more into common knowledge.
Yeah, and I think that it's, in many ways, it's I'm going to hold my hands up and say, yes, as historians, we're failing to counter the factual errors that tend to permeate these discussions.
That wasn't supposed to be an accusation, but if you hold your hand up, I'll take it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a fair cop job. But the Richard Dawkins came out of a group of biologists at Oxford in the 50s, there at Oxford in the 50s and 60s, who basically, as I said in the talk, that they laid the foundations for the field that we now know as evolutionary ecology. And at least, they didn't have this intense focus on individual competition. They didn't have this intense focus on the individual. They were interested in looking at evolution in action on a community basis. So to not group selection, let me hasten to add that for any biologists in the audience, they were interested in looking at the evolution of community and the evolution of social behavior. And that's the thing, this is one thing that always gets me. The one thing that if you have to kind of define, what makes a human being, we're so good at cooperating. This is the other part of the warfare narrative that sometimes blows my little mind a little bit. There's Sarah Hrdy, who is a feminist biologist, sociobiologist, who's emerita professor at the University of California, Davis. She uses the metaphor of the plane travel to take to go beyond the train metaphor that we heard with John Van Damme. She basically says, look, you have 100 people on a plane and we're all a bit uncomfortable and we're all a bit, oh, I don't like this, it's horrible, and I'm crammed up close to people and people smell and it's icky and they're shouting, I wish that baby would shut up and all the rest of it. But you get through it, and at the end of it you get off it and you smile and you say thank you to the air stewards and everything's fine. You put 100 chimpanzees on that plane, nobody's walking off, bits of them are coming off. They will have had the most dreadful fight. We are good at getting on with each other. We are good at cooperating with each other. And this is what always strikes me, that when you look at the way in which the popular accounts in particular of sociobiology and evolutionary play out, their focus is on tricks, on manipulation and on deceit, right? And that is part of social life. But we're also very, very good at being nice, which is an odd thing for a sociologist to say, but nevertheless a true thing. And I think that's one of the things that we desperately do need to do is to get different accounts out, different accounts, not just of the history of science and religion, but also different accounts of how we might interpret, or how we might go about interpreting and applying evolutionary theory to human behavior.
I think one thing people want to hear about from us, I mentioned we're all involved in this project, Equipping Christian Leadership in Age of Science, in terms of what happens, what we've learnt empirically about that sort of cooperation at ground level. So two things I've mentioned. Once over COVID, it doesn't really make the news, only the crazy stuff makes the news. But by and large, the churches we've been working with, both centrally and in detail, have been enormously effective at doing things like encouraging people to have vaccines, explaining the science from the pulpit, even on a one-to-one basis, providing vaccination centres, in all sorts of ways. And something we do in our project regularly is to work through, of course, senior Christian leaders. So in the church, it would be bishops, it would be other senior leaders, and try and get them experiencing science and scientists. And you might imagine that this is a sort of oil and water, salad, try and mix it up and they immediately separate. But we've been doing this for a few years now. And the observational experience, if you put a bunch of theologically trained pastors in a room with some scientists, and it could be in a lab, at first it's a little bit, I'm not quite sure I understand this. After 5 minutes, they're at it, yak, 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 yak. We've seen bishops on their knees playing with robots. We've seen young scientists explaining the stories down their microscopes to theologians. And when they meet together in the bar in the evening, we have to chuck them out because it's closing time, because they're still talking. There's a deep level, empirical, deep, I don't know whether it's a searching after truth or an honesty, or the fact that if any of these people were interested in earning lots of money, they'd all be doing other jobs. I don't know what it is, but there's enough in common, to surprise and delight me. And so those are two examples of actually the cooperation, perhaps you were talking about in the aeroplane.
And yeah, I think one of the things that I'd just like to add to Tom on this point that illustrates one of the most important tenets of science communication that's successful, namely that you trust the person who is communicating. And if you have communities that already trust their church leaders, and the church leaders say, gosh, am I the right person to communicate? If you're the person trusted, yes, you are the right person to communicate. And whoever you can get that is trusted to get your message out there, whether this is communicating social distancing guidance or getting the vaccine or whatever, do it through those communities that already have someone they trust. That's the best avenue to do it, whether this is a footballer, coming back to sports, or someone in the church. And the churches have been extremely effective at this. And I think one of the reasons we have not been hearing about this is precisely the popular narratives that we've just been reflecting on. So it's important to shine a light there, which is what we are doing.
Yeah. I was going to say as well, it's also the places that people trust. So it makes a difference when the church becomes the place where you go to get the vaccine, particularly if there's an organist playing beautiful music to relax you as you wait for your turn, and as you wait out the period afterwards. And again, not just Christian churches. this is one of the most interesting things about the whole kind of science, religion, and conflict. It's not science and religion in conflict, it's science and Christianity in conflict, and particularly the kinds of Christianity at that. So when it comes, and which again turns this debate less into a kind of question of morality, less about kind of the nature, or less about the nature of the human mind and the way in which the human mind encounters the universe, and more towards something that emerges out of a particular, very specific history in the West in particular, about the relationship and a particular colonial kind of relationship as well, I have to say, where you treat science as Western, and as the religion, as the kind of the dominant Western religion. And that again is problematic for all kinds of reasons.
Yeah, I wonder. I know Fran's actually typing an answer to one of the questions, but I mean, I think I was going to just handle this with take it live. We haven't really talked about education yet, and perhaps we should, given how many of us referred to the sort of two cultures divide, and people have pointed out that in England, particularly England and Wales, Scotland to a less extent, but the UK generally. Young people are forced to make educational decisions about being more or less exclusively science or humanities at an extremely young age, something that I'm personally very, very uncomfortable about. And I wondered if either of you had comments on our educational system and whether there are ways in which we could encourage less conflict by actually erasing this necessary parting of the ways. Arthur also asked about scientists talking more about their beliefs more openly, and yet sort of perhaps being confined to limited to their field of expertise. And I worry this understandable narrative of being limited to your field of expertise actually contributes to the sort of fragmentation of disciplines between people that then stop talking to each other altogether. So I think that actually has an educational consequence as well. Thanks, Arthur.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question. And I know I've just typed this as an answer, but I'll repeat it. I've been running school workshops on science humanities for years now in UK schools. And it's absolutely amazing to see how early these beliefs already, are quite widespread in school children, but also how easy they are to dismantle. You don't actually have to do anything all that much to do it. So just as an example, I run workshops on AI and AI history in schools. And I asked, groups of little boys in school, what do you think, who's needed to design AI systems? Let's focus on, for instance, a self-driving car, something everybody can imagine. You immediately get the answer, well, computer scientists. Well, maybe engineers and mathematicians, but that's about it. And then I say, right, who's going to develop the interface? Who's going to put the language commands in? Who's going to understand the psychology of them? Who will decide when that car breaks? Does it break for an animal? Does it break for a child? Does it break for an elderly lady? Who sits down to consider these questions? And suddenly all of the kids come up with ideas. Oh, you'll need psychologists. Oh, you'll probably need medics. You'll probably need linguists and all sorts of things. And oh, somebody needs to translate this. And within 5 minutes, all of those kids understand that the science and humanities divide just doesn't exist in ways that they've been taught, or that's been put out there by politicians who say that non-STEM degrees leave you with nothing but debt, rather than non-STEM degrees land you a space on a team at Google Labs. But there we are. I think it is definitely something that the education system definitely can play some role in supporting, but we also mustn't forget that the education system is not the fault of educators, but that there's cultural structures and political structures behind that. And we can challenge them all from all sides of the debate. And this is why it's so important we have those discussions and have them often and with everyone.
Mandy, we have time for a final remark from you. Thanks so much, Fran. That was lovely.
I'm cautious, very cautious at suggesting any reforms to the education system, which has been in a serious state of permanent revolution for the past 40 years at least. But the fundamental issue is the division between science, or the cultural division between science and society, and the notion that science is something that's different, that it's too difficult for ordinary people to understand, that it's too difficult for ordinary people to do. This notion that scientists are somehow a different and distinct breed. Now, scientists are fascinating people, and I love all of the some of the scientists I love that I've met, but they're people. And this is the key point here, that science is what people do. Science is what scientists do. And it's that approach that we need to look at if we are to avoid the kind of hierarchies of knowledge that lead to those very, very early choices, and the notion that if you're clever, then you go and you do the sciences, and if you're not quite so clever, you can do the humanities, and if you're really not clever at all, well, let's leave that one there. I don't want to perpetuate any more stereotypes.
Well, Mandy, thank you very much indeed. The great white shark of time, talking about metaphors, has caught up with the swimmers of the York Festival of Ideas. But on a more serious front, let me say, as a scientist, in case you hadn't guessed, I'm the scientist here. I am grateful beyond words to the disciplines of humanities and the social sciences and the arts, without which science would not survive. What you've both said is absolutely true. Jeff Beacon is pushing us to answer whether his question on morality, which is a whole evening in itself, could be answered. But let me say, Jeff, that one aspect of that is my experience doing and thinking about science in the context of government, in the Royal Society and universities and research councils as well, is that no, science doesn't have science values or science purpose within itself. Science sits within narratives of purpose and value and morality that, well, we either construct them, or we receive them, or we celebrate them and develop them in narrative traditions or another. Some of those are religious traditions. So that would be my micro. I hope that helps a little bit, gives you a pointer. It's interesting that this very afternoon, I just had news that the Royal Society, of which I'm a fellow and so proud to be, who wouldn't be want to be a member of the oldest scientific institution east in the West, has launched a project on its website this afternoon called Reimagining Science, in which the Royal Society is outlining how the language, the metaphor, the narrative around science needs to change in order for science itself to proceed and serve and be celebrated and give its gift in a healthier and more fruitful way. So I couldn't think of a better day on which to celebrate and talk about this with my colleagues and guests, to whom go my immense thanks, as we all have to thank our colleagues Catherine Leach, Martin Bostock, and others who've been supporting this event, and many, many others over these last 2 weeks. Do folks keep a lookout for the rest of these rich events in the York Festival of Ideas, particularly if I might recommend it, the one remaining event in this festival focus on science, imagination, and the big questions, when I will be in conversation with Krista Tippett, who we are very, very fortunate to be able to host. She's the leading American commentator on the series called On Being, on morality, spirituality, the arts, imagination, science, everything. If you've never heard Krista, don't miss her, right here, 8 o'clock on Friday evening. The recording of this event will be available on the York Ideas YouTube event very soon after the festival ends, and you'll be able to track it in the usual way, typing away into Google or YouTube. If you want to learn more about this topic, you'll find a collection of books written by my guests today and colleagues and others, supplied by Kirsty at Fox Lane Books, our very own festival bookseller. Get your books from her, not only here, but outside the festival too. Do look out for other events. I think I also mentioned this evening's one on atoms. People who came here will enjoy that too. So do check out all those ideas and continue the conversation using on Twitter, social media, using the hashtag York Ideas. With that, I think we're done, apart from our biggest thank you, which is to all those who participated in this event, those that listened and thought and be involved in their conversations, as well as those who provide us with these extremely thought-provoking reactive questions. Thank you everyone very much indeed. See you again soon. Bye-bye.